April 29th, 1945, 13:47 hours, The Hague, Netherlands. 8-year-old Hendrika van der Meer heard them before she saw them. That deep, unmistakable rumble of bomber engines. For 5 long years, that sound had meant only one thing: death and destruction. She looked up from the tulip bulb she'd been trying to chew, her stomach hollow from 3 days without real food, and froze. The sky above the shattered roofs of The Hague was filled with dark silhouettes of aircraft, flying low, too low. Her mother grabbed her by the arm and pulled her close. Together, they pressed against the cold, cracked wall of their damaged apartment building. The British Lancasters were flying at barely 400 feet, impossibly close. Hendrika could see the massive shapes of the planes, their propellers slicing through the air with a roar that made the ground tremble. Windows rattled. Dust drifted from the ceiling. "They're coming to finish us!" someone shouted from across the street. The Dutch had learned to fear those bombers. After the failure of Operation Market Garden and the brutal German reprisals that followed, every roar in the sky brought terror. But something about this was different. The bombers weren't climbing. They weren't forming attack runs. They were maintaining that dangerously low approach, steady, deliberate. And then, the bomb bay doors opened. Hendrika squeezed her eyes shut. But instead of explosions, she heard the strange sound of canvas snapping in the wind. When she looked again, she saw parachutes, dozens of them opening beneath the bellies of the bombers. But these weren't bombs. They were sacks, tumbling, swinging, drifting toward the streets and parks of The Hague. One of them landed barely 30 meters away. The sack burst open on the cobblestones, scattering loaves of bread, tins of meat, and something she had not seen in years: a chocolate bar. For 3 long seconds, her mother just stared in disbelief. Then realization broke through the shock. She screamed, half laughter, half sob, and ran toward the scattered food. Around them, other civilians were emerging from basements and ruined homes, crying, shouting, running through the streets as parachutes drifted down like angels. For years they had feared what fell from the skies. Now, what fell would save them. Hendrika picked up the chocolate bar with trembling hands. The wrapper was unmistakably British: red, blue, and gold, printed with English text and a royal crest. She looked up at the bomber still passing overhead, the sun glinting off its metal skin, and waved with all her strength. Inside that Lancaster, Flight Lieutenant James Wilson looked down at the sight of hundreds of Dutch civilians waving, crying, throwing their arms toward the sky. He felt his throat tighten. For 4 years, he had learned to shut off emotion, to complete his missions, drop his payloads, and not think about what lay beneath. But today was different. For the first time, what dropped from his aircraft would save lives instead of taking them. This was Operation Manna, an extraordinary mission born from desperation, courage, and a fragile truce between enemies. The Winter of Hunger, the Dutch Hunger. Winter of 1944-45 was one of the darkest chapters of the war. A famine not caused by drought or nature, but by deliberate policy. After the failure of Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the Allies' bold but disastrous attempt to seize bridges across the Rhine and strike into Germany, northern Netherlands remained under German occupation, while the southern provinces were liberated. In retaliation for the Dutch resistance's support of the Allies, German authorities imposed systematic restrictions. Food shipments were blocked. Rail transport was halted. Canals were closed. The fertile farmlands in the north could no longer feed the starving cities in the west. The result was catastrophic. By winter, the entire country was frozen. The rivers turned to ice, roads became impassable, and even the countryside began to starve. With no coal or oil, families burned furniture, books, and even floorboards to stay warm. Electricity failed. Water systems froze. People ate anything remotely edible. They boiled leather belts and animal hides into thin soups. They roasted tulip bulbs, the pride of the Netherlands, for a few mouthfuls of bitterness. Doctors, themselves weak from hunger, watched helplessly as patients died from treatable diseases. Hospitals had no medicine. Morgues overflowed. In Amsterdam alone, starvation claimed over 200 lives per day. Funerals became impossible. Bodies were buried in mass graves, and still the bombs fell. The war continued. The world seemed to have forgotten them. A deal with the enemy. By April 1945, the Allies had reached the borders of the occupied Netherlands. Liberation was close, but not close enough to save those dying of hunger each day. Something had to be done. The idea came from the Royal Air Force. Instead of bombs, they would drop food. But there was one impossible obstacle. The Germans still controlled the skies and the cities. Any Allied aircraft flying over would normally be shot down. Negotiating a ceasefire for such an operation was almost unthinkable. Yet, that's exactly what happened. Through the efforts of the Swedish Red Cross, Swiss diplomats, and underground Dutch resistance networks, secret messages were passed between Allied and German officials. The proposal was simple, but extraordinary. RAF bombers would fly specific routes, at fixed times, and at very low altitude, dropping only food, and the Germans would not fire. It was a truce written not on paper, but in humanity. The German commanders, weary, knowing the war was lost, reluctantly agreed. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps pragmatism, or perhaps simply the realization that the world would judge them for allowing an entire nation to starve. And so, the orders went out. Operation Manna begins on April 29, 1945. The first Lancasters took off from RAF airfields in eastern England. Their bomb bays filled not with explosives, but with bread, flour, margarine, tinned meat, and chocolate. The crews had flown hundreds of combat missions, but none like this. They were ordered to fly as low as 400 feet, almost skimming rooftops, to ensure the drops landed accurately in designated zones like The Hague, Rotterdam, Delft, and Utrecht. Each bomber carried nearly 7,000 kilograms of food, packed into burlap sacks and metal containers. Each sack was marked "Food, not bombs" in English and Dutch. The risks were immense. Anti-aircraft guns still dotted the landscape. A single German officer choosing to disobey could turn the mission into a massacre. But the skies remained silent. Not a single shot was fired. For the starving people below, the sight was indescribable. The familiar drone of engines that had once meant terror now brought tears of joy. Civilians flooded the streets, waving sheets, flags, anything they could. Children ran after parachutes. Mothers fell to their knees weeping. Priests and resistance members stood side by side, praying as the food descended like a miracle from the clouds. For Hendrika, the little girl with the chocolate bar, it was the first time in years that she had seen her mother smile without fear. From manna to chowhound. The success of Operation Manna inspired a parallel American effort. Operation Chowhound, launched just days later by the U.S. Army Air Forces. Between April 29 and May 8, 1945, over 11,000 tons of food were dropped by British and American bombers across the occupied Netherlands. The missions continued until Germany's surrender on May 8, and they saved tens of thousands of lives. When Allied ground forces finally entered the cities, they found a population battered but alive, sustained by the food that had fallen from the heavens. A different kind of mission. For Flight Lieutenant Wilson and his crew, Operation Manna was unlike any mission they had ever flown. There were no enemy fighters to dodge, no flak bursts in the sky. But the emotional weight was heavier than any bomb load. as they looked down upon the people below. Thin, skeletal figures waving from shattered streets. They felt something no victory parade could match. Wilson later wrote in his journal, "In 4 years of war, I dropped thousands of bombs. Today, I dropped bread. And it felt like redemption." The operation's name, manna, came from the biblical story of manna from heaven, the food God sent to sustain the Israelites in the desert. For the Dutch, the symbolism was perfect. Legacy of hope. By the time the first food parcels reached Dutch homes, the war was almost over. Germany would surrender within days. But for those who survived that terrible winter, the memory of those bombers, once feared, now beloved, would last forever. In later years, the Dutch people built memorials to honor the airmen who risked their lives to save them. Streets were named after the operation. Survivors told their children and grandchildren about the day the sky brought bread instead of bombs, and for Hendrika van der Meer, that 8-year-old girl who tasted chocolate for the first time in 3 years. The sound of engines would never again mean fear. It would mean hope. Epilogue Operation. Manna remains one of the most remarkable humanitarian missions in modern warfare. An act of compassion amid chaos, courage amid destruction. In the final days of World War II, when hatred and vengeance could have ruled, soldiers and airmen chose mercy instead. Between April 29th and May 8, 1945, the skies over the Netherlands were not weapons of war, but wings of salvation, and in that moment, humanity, battered, starving, but still alive, remembered what it meant to be kind. Even as food began falling from the heavens, the mission's success hung by the thinnest of threads. The fragile agreement between enemies, an unspoken truce built on humanity, depended on one thing: communication. Every German anti-aircraft crew, every Luftwaffe officer, every local commander had to understand that these bombers were not bringing death, but life. It was a dangerous hope. No document could guarantee that a frightened or fanatical gunner wouldn't open fire. The RAF's Bomber Command knew this. Their mission briefings emphasized both the extraordinary humanitarian purpose and the mortal danger involved. Crews were told they would be flying at 400 feet, so low that German ground gunners could hit them with ease if they chose to. They would cross still-occupied territory, following strict corridors toward The Hague, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam, routes carefully mapped to avoid concentrated troop areas. The operation relied not on armor, altitude, or speed, but on trust. The volunteers. When the call went out for volunteers, squadron commanders expected perhaps half of their crews to step forward. The risk was high, but the response stunned them. Nearly every airman volunteered. After years of fire and blood, after watching cities burn beneath their bombs, the chance to drop food instead of explosives struck something deep in every man. This was redemption, a chance to prove that victory meant more than vengeance, that the war's purpose was not only to destroy, but to restore. Flight Lieutenant James Wilson, who had flown 47 missions over Germany, later described that briefing, "At 20,000 feet, you always had a chance. Altitude and speed were protection. But this? We'd be 400 feet up, straight and level, right over German positions. If they fired, we were done. But how could we stand by and watch the Dutch starve? We all volunteered, every last one of us. Transforming bombers into lifelines, the preparation for Operation Manna transformed war machines into instruments of mercy. The mighty Lancaster bombers, designed to carry 10 tons of high explosives, were modified overnight to carry food instead. Bomb racks were fitted with cargo slings and wooden pallets. Each aircraft could carry between 3 and 5 tons of supplies: flour, bread, canned meat, dried milk, chocolate, cigarettes, and even medical kits. Every sack was marked with British and Dutch flags, making it unmistakable from the air and the ground. This was food, not fire. The details were meticulously planned. Bread was baked harder than usual to prevent crushing. Flour was double-bagged. Tins were reinforced to survive the impact. Everything was engineered to hit the ground intact and ready for use. The routes were plotted with combat-level precision. Instead of high-altitude runs designed to minimize exposure, these bombers would fly directly over civilian areas at treetop height to deliver food with pinpoint accuracy. The designated drop zones, parks, open fields, and wide avenues were chosen to minimize risk to civilians. The crews studied maps, memorized landmarks, and rehearsed their drops. One small miscalculation could send food crashing into buildings, or worse, people. There was no margin for error. April 29, 1945, the first dropped thee. Morning broke grey over England, as the first formation of Lancasters lifted from RAF Mildenhall and other airfields in eastern England. The aircraft roared across the North Sea, climbing to cruising altitude before descending through the mist as they approached the Dutch coast. At 400 feet, the bombers were so low that Dutch civilians could see the crew's faces through cockpit glass. For many, this was the first time they had ever looked directly into the eyes of men who had once been the instruments of destruction, and now were bringers of hope. Inside the aircraft, the air crews felt a tension unlike any combat mission. Gunners scanned the ground nervously, knowing that if even one German gunner opened fire, they had no defense. The bomb aimers, men trained to calculate the trajectories of high explosives, now aligned their sights on drop zones filled with starving civilians. At 13:45 hours, the bomb doors opened over The Hague. But instead of the flash and thunder of detonations, there was only the flutter of canvas and nylon parachutes, the gentle descent of sacks carrying life. From below, the Dutch saw the miracle unfold. Families who had not eaten in days flooded into the streets, waving, crying, laughing through tears. Children chased the falling packages. Mothers knelt on the cobblestones, arms raised toward the sky. Sheets and flags appeared in windows. On the ground, some spelled out "Thank you" in giant letters using bed sheets, hoping the airmen above could read their gratitude. Inside the cockpits, hardened veterans, men who had flown through flak over Hamburg and Cologne, felt tears on their cheeks. For years they had dropped destruction, watching the glow of burning cities. Now they saw joy. Some crews added their own small touches. They threw down personal rations, chocolate, cigarettes, biscuits, wrapped in notes that read, "With love from England. Hold on. Help is coming. God bless you. The Germans do not fire." German soldiers watched the spectacle in silence. Anti-aircraft crews stood beside their guns, but kept their hands off the triggers. In some areas, German soldiers even helped Dutch civilians carry food away from drop zones. One officer later admitted that seeing the bombers release food, not bombs, changed him. "It was the first time I understood what defeat would mean, that the enemy was capable of mercy. The agreement had held. The unthinkable had become real. Operation Expands over the following 10 days. Operation Mana became one of the largest humanitarian airlifts ever conducted during active war. The RAF flew more than 3,000 sorties, delivering over 6,000 tons of food to Dutch cities still under occupation. Soon, American bombers joined the effort under Operation Chowhound, launched by the U.S. 8th Air Force. Together, the British and Americans dropped more than $11,000 tons of supplies between April 29th and May 8, 1945, the skies over the Netherlands, once filled with fire and terror, were now filled with mercy, feeding a nation, the Dutch resistance, and local authorities. organized rapidly to collect and distribute the supplies. Trucks, bicycles, and even horse carts appeared within hours. Food was sorted, rationed, and delivered to hospitals, orphanages, and homes of the elderly. The resistance coordinated carefully to prevent hoarding and ensure that every family received something. In The Hague, church bells that had been silent for years rang once more to announce the arrival of food. As the drops continued, the supplies diversified. Flour and bread at first, then dried milk for children, medical kits for hospitals, and even vegetable seeds to begin rebuilding after liberation. The nutritional value was only part of the miracle. The psychological impact was just as powerful. For people who had been living in despair, the falling food was proof of survival, proof that the world had not forgotten them. A dangerous mercy, the success of Operation Manna masked the incredible risks. The airspace over the Netherlands was still filled with German guns, and many batteries remained fully operational. A single misunderstanding could have turned the sky into a killing ground. On several occasions, disaster nearly struck. At Rotterdam, one German flak crew began tracking a Lancaster before their commander ordered them to stand down. In another instance, an American bomber strayed from its designated route and was nearly fired upon before Dutch resistance members signaled the Germans to hold their fire. One British aircraft suffered engine failure and crashed, but miraculously, it came down in territory already liberated by Allied troops. The weather was another relentless enemy. Low-altitude flight through fog, rain, and unpredictable spring winds made navigation treacherous. Several aircraft returned damaged. One was struck by lightning but still managed to release its cargo before limping back across the sea. And yet, through all of it, not a single aircraft was lost to enemy action. Squadron loss rate, 0. Mercy becomes victory as May 1945 arrived. The end of the war drew near. German resistance collapsed. Liberation forces advanced. But for the Dutch, salvation had already come from the skies. The people who had eaten tulip bulbs now held loaves of bread. The children who had fainted from hunger now smiled again, and the sound that had once meant terror now brought tears of joy. Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound did more than feed the hungry. They restored faith in humanity after years of unimaginable cruelty. When the war ended days later, Dutch citizens lined the streets not only to greet their liberators, but to wave once more at the bombers that had saved them. Epilogue in the decades that followed. Survivors would tell their children about the day bread fell from heaven. Pilots who flew those missions would remember them as the most meaningful of their careers. Operation Manna remains one of the most extraordinary acts of mercy in wartime history. WWII moment when soldiers set aside hatred, risked their lives, and chose compassion. In a world at its darkest, they proved that even in war, humanity could still fly. In the final days of April 1945, Operation Manna reached its conclusion. No aircraft were lost, no crews killed, but every flight remained a gamble. RAF airmen risked their lives flying at treetop level over enemy lines, trusting German guns to stay silent. Flight Lieutenant Wilson later reflected, "We'd risked our lives dropping bombs. Risking them to drop food seemed the least we could do." As May dawned, the Netherlands stood on the edge of liberation. The food drops had kept tens of thousands alive long enough to see freedom. When British and Canadian troops finally entered Dutch cities, they were met by crowds waving flags, throwing flowers, and weeping with gratitude. On May 4th, Wilson flew his final mission, dropping flour and medical supplies over Rotterdam. Below, he saw families spelling "Thank you" with bedsheets, waving to the very bombers that once brought destruction. He realized then that victory meant more than defeating Germany. It meant proving that mercy and civilization still existed. When his Lancaster crossed back into England, empty of supplies but full of purpose, Wilson knew what they had achieved. Proof that even amid total war, humanity could still rise above hatred.